So hi York, thanks very much for being on our first Feature Friday. Why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jörg Lev. I'm based out of Germany, and I work as a technical product manager in VMware's cloud provider business unit.
Cool. And for those who don't know me, my name is Guy Bartram. I'm Product Marketing Manager and responsible for the Cloud Director suite of products. And today we're going to talk about one of the key new areas in Cloud Director. Well, I say new, it's been around since what, 9.7, I think it was,
Yeah, yeah.
which is the service extension capability that Cloud Director brings. And really, for me, this is kind of changing the play of Cloud Director completely. Really enabling third parties and indeed, other custom services to be put into the Cloud Director UI. So why don't you just bring us in with a little intro, Jorg, about the service extension capability?
Mhm. Okay, yeah. Today I want to show and demonstrate you how to use vRealize Orchestrator in context of VMware Cloud Director. So there are different scenarios that I want to explain how you can VRO in a yeah Cloud Director environment. But the real focus is, as you mentioned, Guy, to have orchestrator workflows, automating whatever services that you want to offer as a provider to your tenant and publish them into the service library for your tenants. And that's what I'm going to show you today.
So a key component of this is vRealize Orchestrator, right? Which
Yeah.
comes with every instance of Cloud Director. There's no way of not using it, right?
Uh, well, it comes technically with vCenter or our vRealize suite, but almost all service providers that use VMware Cloud Director have VRO in place and use it for different scenarios, either to integrate Cloud Director with external systems that they have on their provider environment, or to automate some day-to-day tasks. That's also something that I want to demonstrate today, or to build some custom services on top of VRO workflows and offer them to their tenants.
Okay. So how does it work with the Cloud Director then?
Okay, let's for that have a look at the concept. So I'm going to share my whiteboard.
All right. There you go. I can
You
see it.
hopefully can see. Yeah. So we got our Cloud Director on the left-hand side with the provider and tenant UI and the VCD API. In Cloud Director, there are different components available that allow the integration with Orchestrator. First of all, the service library, that's to publish Orchestrator workflows into the UI, into the service library in Cloud Director. And then we have blocking tasks and notifications that allow the way back, so that vCloud Director or VMware Cloud Director can call out Orchestrator workflows as part of deployment processes. In Orchestrator, to have a look, we have the workflow libraries, and these workflows, they use objects, endpoints that are provided by plugins in VRO. In VRO, there is a whole bunch of plugins available, a whole ecosystem of plugins, which makes VRO such a powerful tool. So obviously we have tools or plugins for connecting Orchestrator to vCenter, to vCloud Director, VMware Cloud Director, to REST endpoints, to SQL databases, an MQP message bus. But there are also plugins for other services or protocols like SSH, PowerShell, or even plugins from third-party vendors that integrate their systems into Orchestrator. Certain backup vendors, IP address management vendors, and so on have provided plugins. And typically, these plugins also come with a list or set of workflows that you can use either out of the box as they are, or you can create your own workflows based on these library workflows to automate all sorts of processes in your IT environment. Now, in Cloud Director, we obviously follow these two paradigms. First of all, the separation between provider tasks and responsibilities and tenant self-service capabilities. And then the other paradigm in Orchestrator is a strict end-to-end multi-tenancy. So that means Cloud Director offers the capabilities to create different organizations, and then you can create your VApps, gateways, and components in these org VDCs.
Yep.
Now, when it comes to the concepts of how Cloud Director and Orchestrator work together, let's just have a look at two different scenarios how they can be used. So first of all, talking about the blocking tasks and notifications section on here. So that is something where that always has been there in Cloud Director since I think version 1.5, so has ever been there. That's a way to allow Cloud Director to call out, send messages to a message bus based on tasks or processes that happen. So for example, if a tenant creates a new VApp from a catalog, deploys a new VApp from a catalog, then you can either use notifications to just fire message to the message bus, or have it as a blocking task, so the process in Cloud Director stops until the message is received and correspondingly answered. And a lot of these integrations use VRO technically with the AMQP plugin that allows Orchestrator to pick up messages from the message bus and then to kick off workflows based on that. That can be used in a service provider context, for example, to add these newly deployed virtual machines or VMs into a CMDB, or to automatically add them to a monitoring system, stuff like that. So that typically falls into the category of provider operations. And they are, in the blocking tasks, they are more or less invisible for the user. They just happen automatically in background.
Yeah, so these blocking tasks, and I've heard about this functionality before. I haven't really dived into it in any detail, so this is great. I'm learning a lot. These blocking tasks are API only capabilities. You know, if I was a service provider and I wanted to do just that example, I wanted to update my CMDB every time a new VM was created, how would I go about doing that in Cloud Director?
So you have to configure in the Cloud Director UI the blocking tasks and the connection to the message bus, and then have some system like Orchestrator to pick up the messages. Later in the live demo, I will show you the corresponding screens in vCloud Director or VMware Cloud Director where you use and configure these blocking tasks.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the other flavor or the other scenario how you would use Orchestrator in context for VMware Cloud Director is now the service library. That means you can, as a provider, create your workflows in VRO and have these workflow library connected to Cloud Director. And then in Cloud Director, you can select and publish the workflows into either the provider or the tenant or UI in the tenant portal, so that tenant users can actually request services from the UI that are technically backed by VRO workflows. So in backend, there's a workflow kicked off, but that's something also not visible to the tenant. They just receive or get provide the inputs for the workflows as a form, and then they can start request the service and backend. With that, the provider has the capabilities to use all the different plugins and the whole ecosystem that we have in VRO to have these workflows connect with any other system in their IT infrastructure. So it's not related or not necessarily limited to anything that has something to do with vCenter or virtual machines. You can offer whatever additional services, and we will see some examples in the demo later as well.
Okay.
Now, when we look into that in a bit more of a detail, so let me zoom in here. That is something when you create workflows in VRO, these workflows typically need some information to operate. So you have the input parameters for the workflows that are that's information that whoever calls the workflow has to provide. That can be objects in the inventory that come from the different plugins. So you select a virtual machine or a certain REST operation, a database table, something like that, or just plain data types like strings for an email address or a number for amount of resources that you want to order in addition to your existing ones, things like that. And these inputs automatically from the service library in Cloud Director are going to be rendered as a form, a web form. So whenever the user, the tenant user or provider user request such a service, they get the form to see that they have to fill out with the information that later become input parameters for the VRO workflow.
Is
And
that
that's something we will look into that quite in detail, because there that adds some interesting aspects when it comes to tenancy.
sorry to interrupt you? Are those inputs? Are they so those are the parameters that you would normally need to execute a workflow, which could be like, for example, executing a PowerShell script from the PowerShell plugin.
Mhm.
Are they? Equally as they are executing a script, I'm guessing there could be some checking done on the inputs themselves to validate the correct at the
Mhm.
time.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is something every workflow developer should do, because, well, the inputs, they come from an end user. So you never know what they type in and provide as inputs. So you can do a lot of validation either directly in the form based on the input presentation settings in the VRO workflow. We will have a look at that later as well. And of course, you can add somewhere at the beginning of your workflow, you would add, I don't know, a first step to create some validation if something needs to have more logic than what you can run in during the presentation in the web UI form.
And can that be used also to feed back to or create a different? I'm not sure if it's style sheet or whatever is being used to take the input in the input sheet. If you put something incorrect in there and it does a check, and can it then
Mhm.
provide back a different view, saying, I don't know, say you request a new IP address
Mhm.
and you get the subnet wrong, and it says, well, these are the available subnets for you.
Mhm. Yeah, so that is something the well, all of that is very important, because the quality of this input form that's being rendered, that creates the usability for the service, and that avoids some human errors if you make that as easy as possible and still allow flexibility. The input presentation is rendered automatically by the definition, or based on the information that you define in the workflow. However, there are a lot of different options that you have in here. So you can do validation for individual fields in directly before the workflow even gets started, and you can even format the fields in a certain way. So to come back to your example, for example, for IP address ranges or things like that, you can define a drop-down field and only give the end user, list of valid inputs that they select from as a drop-down field.
Got it. Okay, that's brilliant.
Okay. Yeah, with that, I guess let's have a look into our environment and connect to a real Orchestrator server, and then see how you can configure these different scenarios. With that, let me stop sharing and share the connection to my lab environment. So
Okay.
you should now see,
Yep.
oh, VMware Cloud Director. Okay. So I am connected in my lab environment to a Cloud Director instance as a provider administrator. And since we talk about vRealize Orchestrator connection, we talk about, well, either blocking tasks or service library. Focus for today is really service library extensions, but just for the matter of completeness, and since we had this discussion before, I want to show you where to configure the things that you would use for blocking tasks. That is in the administration section in the provider portal. When you go to extensibility, that's where you define the connection to the AMQP broker, so to the message bus, where Cloud Director should send the messages to as part of notifications or blocking tasks. So that's sort of usually a RabbitMQ server or any other AMQP compatible message bus. That also is configured then on the VRO side to pick up the messages. And you can configure if you want to manually the blocking tasks. So you define in which of the operations, like deploying a new VApp from template or rebooting a VApp or whatever, which of these operations you want to block and send out a message and wait for a workflow to complete. So that can be done either manual through the UI form here, but typically, since you want to register a workflow that somehow answers this blocking task and then creates that entry in the CMDB, that typically is done through the API and through workflows anyway as well.
Got it.
For the blocking tasks, we do have some very good examples and some sample workflows out there. So if you go to our code.vmware.com sample exchange and just look for AMQP, or remember that 4982 number as the sample ID, you can download a Cloud Director notifications package, which contains a lot of example workflows for that overall structure, how Cloud Director sends out a message to AMQP, and then VRO picks it up to run a workflow based on that. So some very good examples that get you started with that.
And does any of this change between versions of Cloud Director?
For this one, it does not change because that functionality always has been there since 1.5. There might be some plans in future to replace just the protocol for the message broker, but the current AMQP-based blocking tasks will be deprecated over a couple of versions. So, and the overall concept stays the same. So it's just one protocol that changes, but the overall structure will stay the same.
Got it. Okay.
The only thing that is really version dependent is the VCD plugin for VRO. So in Orchestrator, to allow Orchestrator workflows connect back to vCloud Director, that's version dependent, and we have different plugins for the different VMware Cloud Director versions, but they are also backwards compatible. So when you connect to Cloud Director, you select an API version and can have a newer plugin connect to an older version of Cloud Director.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. The other setting or the other scenario where you want to use Orchestrator in Cloud Director context is in the service library. So again, I'm back in my provider portal, and I can go to the service library. First of all, go to service management. And in service management, that's where you connect your Orchestrator server with the hostname, provide the credentials, and the SSL certificate. And you can define service categories, which are just different categories to structure the workflows that you add to the library later. When you create them, you also can select some icons just for some nicer user experience in the UI.
Yeah.
In the service library then, that's where you actually select workflows from VRO to add them to the service library. So the configuration is 2 steps. First of all, in the service library, you select the workflow that you want to offer to your tenant and add it to the library. And then in a second step, talking about the multi-tenancy paradigm in Cloud Director, the second step is then to publish this workflow individually to your different tenants. And let's quickly just have a look at the process and how that process works. So I'm connecting back in my other screen to vRealize Orchestrator client. And in this client, I'm just going to create a new demo workflow, really just to have a workflow ready, and going to have just a simple, very empty workflow that does not do anything yet, just to have it in the library, because I just want to show you the process. So in the service library, you then can select your category that you defined in the category definition. You select the VRO and server, and then you can look through the workflow history, or workflow tree that you have in your VRO server. And I created this workflow. Here is it, the demo workflow, and then you can add that to the service library. And once you have created that or added it to the service library, then you can publish the workflow to your different tenants or the service provider. So for the service provider, that activates the execute button in the library in the provider UI. And for the tenants, you can publish them selectively either to all tenants or to your individual tenants or organizations to have the multi-tenancy, and allows you to offer different services to different tenants.
So just so I make sure I understood here. So
Mhm.
if I've got a ton of, let's say, PowerShell scripts today in my operations, and
Mhm.
I wanted to, maybe they're things like raise a help desk ticket,
Mhm.
very simple workflow, which
Mhm.
could be quite complicated, or something like provision new customer.
Mhm.
To provision new customer, take what is typically a level two kind of engineer task and provide
Mhm.
that up to a level one operator in
Yeah.
service tiles in VCD.
Mhm.
And I could also take something like create a help desk ticket and publish that to customers.
Absolutely, yeah. So, and from a consumer perspective, so in Cloud Director, since it's wrapped all in Orchestrator workflows, it does not matter which technology you use in background. So we have one example here for one that you actually mentioned about onboarding a new tenant. So
Yep.
this workflow can get quite complex depending on the different functionality that you want to offer. So you typically have to create an organization, create an org VDC, create a gateway, edge gateway in that organization, add that to the organization, things like that. So these can be implemented, these processes can be implemented either directly in Orchestrator, or you could use the PowerShell plugin that comes with Orchestrator to call out to a PowerShell host and then run PowerShell scripts as these individual building blocks here. However, that does not really matter. The important part is it is an orchestrator workflow, and I mentioned before on the whiteboard you have input parameters for the that are needed for the overall process to continue. In my case, to onboard a new tenant, it's just a tenant name, and all the other things, let's assume we have them based on some convention or some external configuration. And so it's very simple to create a new tenant just by getting or typing in the new name. And this workflow now would be a workflow that's targeted for a service provider admin.
Mhm.
So we have already published that in the library and published it to the service provider admins. And now even a level one provider admin can run this workflow to onboard a new tenant. And tenant name in here.
And I guess you can have live kind of feedback at every stage that you wanted throughout the that long process that you showed earlier.
Mhm. Yeah, so that is something we will see in a second when I click that finish button and create a new tenant. Cloud Director will kick off the workflow in background. This workflow will be just run as a part of events. And in Orchestrator, we then can see, based on built-in Orchestrator mechanisms, you can see the workflow, a new instance of that workflow is running, and then it jumps through the workflow, does the individual tasks that are necessary as part of the workflow. And you can see the workflow executions and the details of the workflow execution in Cloud Director, in Orchestrator. The overall task, if it's running or successful, that's something that's feeded back, as you can see here, in the recent tasks in Cloud Director.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. So if something's
Okay.
wrong, you can see here what it is and what.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the failure and the error message, that it failed, and the error message, and then you would have to look into, typically in Orchestrator, see the workflow execution and see that failed, and then check why it's failing.
So there's a lot of kind of thought needs to go into this workflow and how to provide the logging level essentially
Mhm.
back. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's where the power of this overall architecture comes in, because the idea is that you automate you can automate complex processes in a way using the orchestrator mechanisms to have them very, very reliable and very unlikely for human errors, because it was very easy to run that workflow. I just had to type in a tenant name. So it's sort of wrapping complex workflows in something that is very easy and simple to use. That's the big benefit of having these orchestrator workflows in the library.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that as a huge value for providing
Mhm.
for tenants.
Yeah, so that's something in this example that we just ran through. I think it completed now. Yeah, we see the workflow completed successfully. So we should see in the provider portal that we now have a net new tenant, and this net new tenant has a new OrgVDC that got created based on our convention for the net new tenant, and this OrgVDC also should have an edge gateway because that was part from our deployment workflow. And you can imagine that this workflow now, just for demo purposes, automated a lot of different steps in Cloud Director, but you can imagine that the workflow also adds a lot of different steps in other systems. So to create, I don't know, a new tenant in a CMDB, create some new, I don't know, entry in some customer relationship to update a ticket there for the tenant provisioning, or an order process, something like that. So it's very flexible, and you get the power of all the different VRO plugin to connect to these endpoints way beyond just vSphere and Cloud Director.
That's brilliant. I could see huge value in integrating this into your general kind of OSS inside a provider, but just getting rid of those manual processes and thinking about how you want to onboard customers, how you want to deliver services faster and more effectively, and getting your more expensive level 2, level 3 engineers to focus on the more complex stuff and make this stuff easier, so a level 1 engineer or potentially a customer could run it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we already have a lot of partners that are doing that. Well, for onboarding a new tenant, it's obviously rather goes into the provider area, but the idea is that you have these service libraries and the workflows there, and you can publish them also to your different tenants. So if you have business processes that, for example, allow a tenant to increase the capacity in their OrgVDC, perhaps based on some approvals, perhaps to edit it somewhere in some chargeback or business portal where you do the billing for. But the idea is to have that even complex process published so that the tenant can do that in a self-service fashion.
Yeah, sure. Great way to get tenants to consume more services much easier.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. One example we have here, that's a rather simple one. So because it's an out-of-the-box workflow in VRO to send an email, and that is in our case, well, you can use that obviously very easily to send an email to an help desk system to create a ticket. You can also offer some more sophisticated ticket integration. But the idea is to publish this sort of workflows to your tenants, to all tenants, and then I'm switching over to Tenant View. So now I'm logged in to my tenant T1 here as an organization admin. And then you can see in the service library, the service library, these are now the workflows that have been published for me, and then I can run them from there in, from a tenant context. And then, but again, the tenant, if it runs, some message that you rarely get, I guess. But anyway, if you run that from a tenant perspective, you can see that the workflow is being kicked off, but the rest of the process is completely hidden from you. Of course, you can see it again in the recent tasks from your provider or from your tenant UI, but the actual implementation, and no matter how complex that workflow is in the background, that's something that you as a tenant don't have to care about.
Brilliant.
And for all of that, of course, we can see, I think, good structured in the service library, send an email to the admin. That rather simple workflow that I think just wraps an out-of-the-box VRO workflow that comes with the VRO library.
Brilliant. Well,
okay.
I think we've seen a great example there of VRO and the service. What do you call those? The service tiles within the service library. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Okay. Yeah.
And where to go and get some demo code. Could you just show us the site again, the demo code, so we can see what's available?
Yeah. So first of all, we have on code.vmware.com the notifications package for the for the MQP messages, but that also contains some examples. I mean, the service offerings that you have into the service library, they do not necessarily have to be even related to Cloud Director. So you can use whatever Orchestrator workflows you have, either in your library or from other projects or from even your infrastructure automation, and wrap them into something that you want to offer to your tenant in a self-service fashion.
Right. So I guess the kind of message for everyone here is, vRealize Orchestrator is there. It's a free part of your package already. If you have scripts in your operations, and I highly doubt there's anyone out there who doesn't, there's most likely a plugin for them which could pull them into VRO, and then expose them into Cloud Director as you want.
Yeah, and the strategy, or a very common strategy, is really to have a look at the typical tenant requests that you now have to somehow implement manually, either by having tenants to offer or to request that via a web form, or write an email, open a support ticket, and then you have some manual processes, and look at the ones that are either very time consuming, so they eat up a lot of your resources, or something that is requested very, very heavily, because that's something that you want to automate. And if you manage to automate that in Orchestrator and publish it into the service library, then you have can provide a much better service quality for your tenants, because the tenants can then request these things fully automatically in a self-service fashion, and they don't need to have these long ticket cycles going backward forward with the support or the implementation of the service.
Yeah, excellent. Well, okay, so you heard it here, right? So optimize your operations with vRealize operations and exposing that in service tiles and library in Cloud Director.
If you want to give it a try, one more thing, we have in our public hands-on labs catalog that you know from the on labs.hol.vmware.com, we do have a lab environment that has the setup quite exactly in the same way as I demonstrated here. So if you log into the hands-on labs and then go to the hybrid cloud section where we have all the Cloud Director labs, there is one lab that's called Cloud Provider Platform, Cloud Director for Service Provider, with integration and extensibility. And this hands-on lab, it doesn't have any specific step-by-step guidance for the things for Orchestrator integration. However, when you enroll to that lab, you get access to a lab pod, an environment that looks quite exactly the same as I used in the demonstration. So you can sort of walk through and play around with the different components and the workflows that you've seen there and publish them into Cloud Director.
Brilliant. So that's 2083-2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. It does not have, well, depends on when you watch the video, but it does not necessarily have the latest version of Cloud Director install. However, for the functionality we discussed today with the VRO integration, that works technically back from Cloud Director 9.5.
Okay, great. Jörg, thank you very much for your time today, and really appreciate you running through the service integration. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.